We about ready?
Oh, yeah, we are more than ready.
Finished the midterm. We're moving into the second half of the course. We've read and been examined on and done splendidly, I've heard already briefly on the exam. Those give you the big ideas, the five or six sections of these in the first half. And what we're going to do in the second half is apply these in various ways to different cities, different contexts, different situations, show how any one of them is too simple, but we use often 2 or 3 or 4 of these alternative conceptual perspectives, even if they have been presented as dogmatic one interpretation. And this really explains, in Chicago, you had to be Daley, and then Daley did what he wanted, and that's the explanation. That's the leadership theory. Leaving out citizens, leaving out organized groups, leaving out political culture and the arts and so forth. Okay. So what we want to do in the second half of the course is give you, if you're working on new things yourself, a paper, jobs you've had now and in the future, past, where you may have done this earlier, in that way, look for ways of thinking creatively beyond just repeating what's in the books you read. We're trying to give you tools to use in thinking, in this case, more specifically in this section about power. The issues about power are broad in the sense that they are both, okay, let me back up. In the community power area, this debate was so active, so heated, went on so long, got so many smart people from the late 60s to the 80s roughly, that the concept of power has been sharpened here better than anywhere else, better than in any other field, whether it's organizations or families or nation states or cities. Were you able to reach here?
Yeah, I got this big piece.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay. The power is involved in all of these in different subtle and less subtle kinds of ways. And the ways, that's the big point. Power is complicated, like everything else I'm saying in this course. You can have a crude, simple version, such as Daley explains, knowing that it was a policy under Daley. One explained how it happened. That could. Can you please close the door? Thank you. In the next section, I'll talk about 16 Faces of Power. That's the original title of a draft, which I'm going to use. But I'm building up to that. But that gives you a hint that there are 16 different dimensions of power to think about, not 1 or 5 or 3, because there's several papers published called the 2 Faces of Power or the second face of power, something like that. But they're not 2, they're 16. Okay. I also mentioned briefly nations. Maybe your interest or my interest, we started with, the big world questions. Where does Marx work? How does capitalism change things or not? And then how can we, 1, 2, how can we answer that kind of question? The problem with nations, even though much of the active literature then would say C. Wright Mills's book, um, and Floyd Hunter, of course, Marx and all kinds of Marxism that came later on. Data are harder to get from interviews if you try to do it ethnographically. People lie more, they're more sophisticated, they can tease you better and tell you interesting stories. You can do better field work if you've got more access, but especially big variations. Not just one word in a sentence, which is the difference between this or that, but between places like when you talk about capitalism, how about studying it inside China, which has a century, a long history, or Russia, I was going to say, with a century of anti-capitalist policies. China since World War II, but then they and other places are now changing a lot in ways that make these things more complex. That's nations. How about international relations? We talked about globalization with Saskia Sassen and others. And the main theory about globalization came from Lenin, that Lenin's ideas of global capitalism drove everything. And they didn't, as long as the world was capitalist, the socialist progressive people had to fight the rest of the world and had to try to change it. Okay, that's one theory of international relations. The main theories of IR have been developed here at the University of Chicago in the last 20, 30 years. And they talk about real international relations, or realpolitik, different names, but real is often used. Real in this sense tends to mean what? Anybody have an IR course or read some of this stuff? What does real mean in international relations? Geographic proximity, three and a half things, almost four things. Geographic proximity, economic power, big GNP, lots of money that you can spend on military and other stuff. Nationalism, with a focus on citizens and support in some way, but loosely defined. And then the military. I mean, how many guns, how many tanks, how many airplanes? That's IR. Now, the smart people who do this, who teach this themselves, know this is too simple. They know there are lots of other things going on. And I've had two or more of them come to class, different classes where we talk about these kinds of things. I've had dialogues and debates going on with the IR people for 30 years. And within the field of IR, the same thing is going on. So I asked a group, and I'm an appointment in the class that includes international relations. So I go to receptions, I talk to the students, I talk to the faculty, teaching main IR courses. And the last time I asked a question, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, because of COVID, well, I asked the same question 20 years ago. What proportion of the students in the IR courses and in the program, which really follow this kind of realpolitik? And 20, 30 years ago, most people did. About 3, 4 years ago, maybe 20%. So 80% of the students majoring in IR, taking IR courses, don't feel that these really are explaining much anymore. If they ever did. Okay, this is why so the big point of this course is that things are more complicated than one simple theory. And if you want a simplistic real, no, not real, should be this. So all right, so I've had both faculty and students linking with this, and the whole field of IR is changing. Why? For many of the same reasons that the new political culture has grown more important, especially citizens are more educated. They're more, they think. They no longer want to be cogs in a machine to elect a mayor, nor do they want to just be troops in an army where they don't think for themselves. And with the Nuremberg trials and so forth, top military officials were taught, even if the Führer said, you know, gas everybody in those chambers, you were responsible if you turn on the gas. Okay, so the sense of responsibility going down the hierarchy has risen with a sense of individual responsibility at every level, even within the military. One reason, many are there, but one reason that the Soviet Union gave up the communist commitment was the mothers of the troops killed in Afghanistan were too numerous, and they wanted the end of all this stuff. You could say this is Lenin's concept of international socialism, but if you no longer support communism, and basically Putin has nothing to do with it, nothing. Putin is not part of, doesn't have a communist party or the Chinese do. Many Chinese don't follow Marxism with any degree of literalness now, but in Russia, okay, far less still. Okay, so the point, so who follows Marxism? People in English departments in the U.S. and Western Europe. Not just, but that's the classic base. And did we find anything with Bernie Sanders you want to show?
Abhishek?
You find a Sanders section?
I couldn't find a section. I just found the video. Like I just take there's a 2-minute special speech on that.
Okay, so the answer is no, I think. Okay, all right, that's fine. If we don't find, we're trying to find a good selection from Bernie Sanders where he articulates capitalism and business leadership in Wall Street are the main problems preventing social programs and so forth within the U.S. I'm trying to show you that there are many people in the U.S. who still talk this way. Not just, so he may not be, and many people in California who supported Bernie Sanders are not in the presidential primary there, are not Marxist in a literal sense, but they still may think of capitalism and business leadership as really the main explanation of life. Okay, and that's basically what Bernie Sanders learned when he was a student at the SSA years ago, and then as mayor of Bloomington, Vermont. Okay, I won't say he learned it in Brooklyn, and he's continued to say the same things he learned in Brooklyn in probably 1940s or so. Yes, these overlap with ideology. Yes, these are parts of political party programs. Yes, they are global as well as local, but what I'm coming to again in showing you this illustration, one of the best ways to handle on this is to look at variations across nationally, across cities, and there are more cities than there are countries. If you've got only 160 countries in the whole world and only 20 or 5 or so in Europe, you can't test something statistically to see what if there are 5 factors going on. Just to mention 5 and more than 5. If we want to try to measure the impacts of these different factors, we can't study the impact of 5 independent variables with 25 cases. Can't be done statistically. That is, you just get noise and bias. So you need a lot of cases. So what's the solution? Study cities, study neighborhoods, study individuals, and then put the results back together with the international. So look at how much the Chinese citizens differ from the Russian citizens, from the French citizens, from the American citizens, and which of those are the most opposed to capitalism and against markets? The French. French are more opposed to markets than people in India, China, and many other places. Okay. The first reading, so join this, we remember my suggestion. How do we deal with these kinds of ideological issues? Sharper concepts, better data. The sharper concepts come from looking at these debates, and they were there in the 60s and 70s. I would say the general debates were similar to today. The heat was greater. The sophistication was no good at the beginning, but over the years, as we got more and more smart people really working in power and domination, legitimacy, and hierarchy, these overlapping concepts, they got to be more and more sophisticated. But then what happened? People forgot about it. They stopped reading Hunter and Dahl. If they were doing IR, they would only read recent IR papers. But they lost the subtlety of the concepts, which is why we're reading these now, even if the dates on these books are not last week. But the reason I'm trying to get last week is to show you Bernie Sanders and a lot of other people in Rio and other places who may speak as if things are the same as they were when Lenin wrote. Okay. So Max Weber was writing in a context of these concerns at the very end of the 19th century, class status and power, class status and party. And his simple idea in the title of the paper, in which I've used already, is multi-causality. Don't look for one explanation, whether it's money or jobs or your father's occupation or something else like that, which may be part of class or part of capitalism, or a general label like socialism or communism. So what he stressed in particular were the differences between class and status. So status, what did he mean by status? Yes, you're honest with your math?
Yes.
Okay, good. Go ahead.
I know that there was a mention of social honor.
Just a little slower and a little louder.
I know there was a mention of social honor, for example, religious, political, etc.
Okay. Now, any more et cetera? Just other examples? Anybody else too as well? But go ahead. I don't mean to stop you, but just others can help you if you're.
Maybe like family or some kind of.
Yes.
I don't know,
Yes.
bourgeois
Yes.
Sort of.
Yes.
High status.
Okay. No. So the point is, it's a loose, broad concept. Social honor can be present in a family, a father and a daughter. It can be it can be religious. People respect the Pope not because of his investments or his capitalist position, but because of the hierarchy of the church, or the minister in one congregation is respected because of the leadership of it. Religious because he knows more about religion and theology and is trained as a more theologically sensitive than an average person. Okay, so anything else you want to add?
Yeah, just to answer your question of other dimensions of power beyond economic and multi-causality.
Okay. So then, I mean, that's the big point. And so social honor or status are perhaps the best general labels for this. But status could even be, or that is other things may not even be just honor. They may be ideals. They may be, so I'm in a sense, I'm going beyond Weber and saying, in this course, we can think of, and you can see yourselves, there are other things in life besides honor and status that, and on one hand, and class in a neo-Marxist sense of access to the means of differential access to the means of production, whether it's through ownership or your job as a manager versus a capitalist investor, or as a worker. Power in some kind of way may be based on who's first in line, who got there first. It may be based on hair color. It may be based on racism. Maybe based on other things, which if you try to say Max Weber meant everything by social honor, I'm looking at the studies of this over the whole 20th century, following him. I'm simply pointing out that how about Thorstein Veblen and Pierre Bourdieu? What's their big idea? What's the big idea in Bronzeville that gets most talked about? Respect. He dissed me. Okay. So respect and is seen as something which you show in ways that may or may not be linked with honor. But the point I'm getting to further, when we read about the propositions in the cities and entertainment machine, there are about 50 or 40, 50 propositions there in the chapter 2, I guess it is. What leads to political systems doing this or that? And I mentioned Veblen and Bourdieu. What's their simple idea? Conspicuous consumption. What's that? Thorstein Veblen was a young faculty member here around 1900, and he wrote a book on these issues. Pierre Bourdieu in 70s and 80s talked about his big idea was basically the same. His big book was called Distinction, and he basically, even though he would talk about multi-causality, he basically would bring it back to distinction. What I'm getting at is conspicuous consumption and honor in the sense of hierarchical honor and respect is not enough. I mentioned standing in line or your hair color or something else like that as being a source of getting things done better. And people have done ethnographic studies, novels, all kinds of other things, showing if you're polite, if you smile, that can make a difference. Smiling. I'm trying to smile more myself. Okay. All right. So Weber opened the door. The 20th century, lots of people came in. Just to give you one example of Mr. Distinction, Pierre Bourdieu, I knew him very well when I was working on my thesis in Paris. And I said to him at one point, why don't we try to test your ideas about people at the top, people at the bottom, and who respects who more? Who's done the most careful, let's say, occupational studies of these in the world? Anybody know? Called the NORC Occupational Prestige Scale. It's right across the Midway. National Opinion Research Center Occupational Prestige Scale. Since the 1940s or whatever, people started out east, and actually I have my office at Sam Stauffer's office. Stauffer was the key person who did this work. And he wrote a book on communism, conformance of liberties. The idea is that if you just give people a list of job titles like lawyer, doctor, janitor, taxi driver, and then say how respected, how much do you respect these and how much either you or the people in general respect the following occupations. And then they rank them either as a, from just by name, or they may assign a scale from 1 to 10 on the amount of prestige. That's a simple idea. As this has then grown and people have done this more and more, they've added more and more job titles. They've taken it internationally. And there's a main paper by Rossi, Hodge, and Tryman. And then Tryman spent his whole career basically elaborating the core idea that you find the same kind of hierarchy of jobs everywhere in the world. That's the strong form of the argument. That not only do people rank jobs in terms of honor, but everybody in the world ranks roughly the same way. Okay, Bourdieu implicitly is saying something like that, but he's not dealing with the subtleties of these different jobs. He's simply basically saying that the people at the top, people at the bottom, the people at the top drive the people at the bottom. So I said to Bourdieu, instead of just saying that so simply, why don't we study occupations in France, occupations in the US, and not just use the simple ones, but let's add about 10 more, and such as journal editor of a distinctive journal like Tom Moderne. That is, Jean-Paul Sartre was the man. He was a hero. He was God for intellectuals in Paris in the late 40s and 50s. He said everybody wanted to be a little Jean-Paul Sartre, including students. I taught the sort one twice. Students would they would have phrases and stuff. Okay. So that is the first time I talked there. The second time I talked there, nobody listened to what I said. They read the newspaper in the back. I couldn't believe it. It was worse than American high school where they talk about people don't listen, people just make noise in the back of the room. Okay, that was the same course, same sort of line. Okay. So I'm not diverting. These are all points that make my general point. Why are there differences that people answer these questions, or including saying, this isn't interesting to me? Whereas 1973, first time, 1973, every student, every faculty member really. And so Bourdieu didn't invent this. Bourdieu was telling you what most people in his surroundings were saying when he was a student. Then he simplified and he did it with polish. But so the point is, we did this survey. We added a lot more titles, things very high, not just minister or Roman Catholic priest or priest. We asked the top, say an archbishop in the Roman Catholic Church. We had some very elite. We had a general in the army, not just military officer, but 5-star generals. This is something of that sort. And so we had more range, in part because this is what people were writing about in terms of the intellectuals who were particularly important. But then we also wanted to compare France and the US, because you have people who come here, say Polish doctors who came here and they had a communist background in Poland. They grew up under, say, people who were studying medical schools in the 40s and 50s, came to the US in the 60s or 70s, and they would say, I don't like America. Why not? There's no respect for doctors. Even though Poland was supposed to be communist egalitarian. What's wrong with the theory? Okay, so we wanted to get at that kind of theory, and that honor was different from broader criteria. That is how to link it in this way. And the bottom line was, unlike Tryman, we found big differences between France. Let me back up. If we took the same occupations as Tryman and others did from NORC, the shorter list, parlay France and the US are about 0.9, 0.8. They're almost, overall the rankings are about the same. But when you get the specific rankings, like Roman Catholic, say Archbishop, and then you look at the French data and you look at the American data, the Americans have had lower respect given to some of these elite Roman Catholic positions. And second, more important in some respects, inside France, the people who respected Roman Catholic archbishops said, yes, I'm a Catholic. The people who said, or we asked this of mayors, and we asked this of citizens in later studies. And the people who say, I'm a socialist or I'm a communist, said, oh, bishops, not only do I not respect them, nobody respects a bishop. You know, that's the they were dead in the 19th century. This is, Catholicism is highly politicized today in France in ways that it was in the 19th century, in ways that it never has been in the US. So in that sense, you can get differences that you can capture with more subtle analysis of individual occupations, but especially if you choose extremes. And that's the reason for studying citizens and cities and neighborhoods in order to study power and honor, to build on the lessons of Max Weber and Thorstein Veblen, but to go beyond them and say it's more than conspicuous consumption, it's more than honor, there's other stuff too. And you can find it with pretty simple methods as I did with Bourdieu to show Bourdieu was wrong. Okay. All right. So Robert and Helen Lynn, just running down the key readings. I've talked about this a little bit before. The big story, the quick story is they did two books, Middletown and Middletown in Transition. What was the difference between the two? Middletown was intended to be, yeah, go ahead.
Wasn't Middletown in Transition focused on kind of looking at like food factories?
Just a little bit louder.
Wasn't Middletown in Transition focused more on motor factories as opposed to the Great Depression? And was Middletown focused before the Great Depression?
Yes. Any more that they said then about not just the fact that there was a depression, but what else changed in what they said about the town itself?
Didn't it kind of reflect like a tone change where before they didn't care as much who owned
You said a tone chamber?
tone change, like they didn't care as much before who owned the factories and things like that, but afterwards they became a lot more aware of it.
Yes. But was it the factory as a building that was important?
Or like as a business, with like kind of a difference in like wealth of the people who owned it and the people who worked there, used its services.
Any other concepts that I've just been talking about? Capitalism. Capital. Okay, it was heavily influenced by Marx and Marx's categories of capitalism, capital, owners, etc., versus workers. Whereas their first book was not at all. So they changed the perspective, and so did many other intellectuals, social scientists, and journalists in the 30s. Then in the 50s and early 60s, people became much less focused on those kinds of conflicts. And in the late 60s and 70s, what happened? Counterculture. From 65 to 70, cities were burning, especially cities with more poor and African-American population. But lots of conflict, and we've talked in various ways how those conflicts are which go back to 1848, the late 19th century, 1930s, the counterculture in the 60s. We had a little bit of that two summers ago, so, with some of the big cities like Chicago with looting, with problems with the police, etc. That gave you a flavor, a flashback to the late 60s into the 1930s. So I'm not trying to pinpoint in what I'm just saying right now, causality, but I'm saying these things go together in ways that suggest we're not talking about permanent, lifelong, eternal patterns, whether it's the occupational prestige scale or capitalism or whatever. These things change in the minds of citizens and in the minds of social scientists in ways that we can and have measured as we have more solid data over time, and we're getting much better data for larger ends now globally. So, okay. Floyd Hunter, what did he add? The title of this book was Community Power Structure. Most important thing he added was that title. The field took the name from him, and for 10 years he really dominated the field. Then along came Robert Dahl, and the Hunter-Dahl debate, so-called, was a major spur of sharpening these ideas, which I'm talking about. And it was framed in terms of those two, but that's why we're looking for Bernie Sanders or for other people. It didn't end with Dahl and Hunter. It still is going on in various ways. Hunters, actually, could we put up our the first figure, please? I'm sort of going through some of the dimensions of these perspectives. There we go. That's perfect. Yeah, so we can change that. That's fine. Yeah, we can get the second. There. What I'm going to do is fill you in on these columns. Why don't you just flash down to the second page? Then we can come back so you can see what the second page. Okay, we got the Linz, the Hunter, the Dahl, Holsey, Wolfinger, and Wildofsky. And this great debate going on. I did a paper on it, the American Sociologist letter, Muslim Holsey. Okay, let's go back up to this. That's the overview of some of the issues. Okay, what these columns show in my neat handwriting. Traditional elitists, Hunter, Dahl, and then comparative researchers, comparative urban researchers. The traditional, let me introduce this, I didn't mention today. Vilfredo Pareto, Gaetano Mosca were late 19th century Italian elite theorists who shaped some of the ideas that there's always a pyramid and the little people at the top are always a very small minority. That was their idea, which they took from the Roman Empire up through the nationalization. That is Italian, that it was a distinctly Italian style and conceptualization. And in that perspective, they stressed what we can call base resources. That is, they didn't look at these more subtle measures of power. They talked about, in part because they were writing generally historically. That is, they and many Italians even today still see the whole world in terms of the Roman Empire. Why did we decline? And why are we no longer ruling the world from Portugal to beyond Syria? Okay. So the quick point I'm making is base resources like occupation, ethnic background, gender. You can look at with, you can measure and compare with historical data, crude historical data. Does Dahl ever do this in his book, The Governance? And if so, where? We talked about it briefly, and I'm just reminding you, if you don't remember yourself, these are big points in Dahl. Where does Dahl use the base resources in his traditional approach? Is there background for what he did historically? What's the historical background? Now, maybe it may not have been in the narrow pages. If you read more of the book, you'll see more. But the detail is at the beginning was over the 19th century when Dahl was not there to interview people. He took the data from the city council and the mayor. That is, he took the social background characteristics especially. And the simple point there was they were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in the early to mid 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, and this was true as well in New York and Boston and many other places, Chicago especially, you had more immigrants increasing in numbers in the city population, and not maybe initially, but pretty soon in voting. And they voted out the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And then what did I tell you the WASPs did in New Haven, in contrast to New York? The WASPs at least in the account reported by Dahl were gentlemanly, and they said, well, we lost. We will move to the suburbs. We will not engage in politics in New Haven anymore. In New York, in the PhD of Gabriel Allman, he showed how some of the previous elite created a whole set of interest groups and civic groups that monitored and criticized first the reports of government agencies, but second, they created a new constitution, a new legal framework for the city of New York, which weakened the mayor and weakened the city council and strengthened some outside legal positions, which would collect data and would be able to challenge. And often the challenger who's done it successfully has been the next mayor, A.B. I believe this was true. Okay. Okay. So the culture of criticizing the leadership is another pattern which shows multi-causality, which seeks to weaken power through the base resource of the law or the social background, things that you can easily study historically, as I've just been describing. And then in terms of this elite theory, the idea was, if you hold that position, if you're the mayor, if you're a city council member, then we want to know if you're WASP or not. And then based on your position and the base resource, we then have results. And the elite identity, as it was reported and related, basically, the elites assumed to be essentially, especially in strong version from Moscow and Pareto, elites always dominate. And so they more or less assume that, but then they assume that because they don't have an alternative to compare, an alternative source of evidence to assess their data against. Okay, that's what the next columns add. Okay, 1953, we're arbitrarily starting there with Hunter. Hunter's concept we can call power. His method is later been called reputational. What did that mean? What was his one simple question that he basically asked? Who's powerful in Atlanta? You're giving the answer? Okay. Okay. Why I'm asking you what was his question? I'm not asking for his answer. And then my follow-up is, what's wrong with the question? I already said this about 2 weeks ago.
Doesn't define power.
Um, by using the word by power, that's, you're showing, you've got a little bit of Doll in there. And that's fine, but we should be conscious of that. In a sense. So if we're saying what this Hunter's question capture, and his question is who's powerful? Does the powerfulness by, or does the answer by power? Dahl would say no, but that answer to the reputational question might by influence. So Dahl used the term influence, just to contrast with a cruder, looser general term of power. Influence in the sense that it's people doing things, making concrete decisions that you can see and talk about, rather than assuming that a WASP is powerful if he's in the city council. So that's the big criticism of the method of Hunter, that it was reputational and merely reputational in the sense that you may say, oh yeah, he comes from an old family, he's powerful in Atlanta. And the answer which Hunter then presented was, there were some traditional leaders, but the main leaders were business leaders in major corporations in Atlanta. And he generalized that this is true in much of the world, or certainly in the US, because we're capitalists. In later discussions, it's not, and he's sloppy in the book. He wrote a bestseller. It's messy, it's loosely put together. He said subsequently in conferences I was at that I was a Stalinist Marxist when I wrote the book. Stalinist. Okay. You wouldn't see it if you read each of the pages. But that was his background, self-report. Okay. So Dahl comes along from between 53 and 61. Dahl comes along and says, Hunter, you're wrong. You've done the wrong thing. You're not measuring, you're not capturing power at all. You don't even know what power is. And instead of talking about power, you want to start with these kinds of things that are over here. Money, jobs, votes, but call them simply resources. And so that term resources really comes from Dobbs. Francesca? Fernando. Okay, so Fernando, you were there in doing that. I'm just trying to have you explicitly identify what came along, why, and how can you, yes, use them, but distinguish, because you're going to be talking with people who have all these different conceptions in the next years to come, and in their writings, and using these ideas, often interchangeably and loosely. I'm trying to get you to sharpen, because you get different answers if you ask one word different. So what did Dahl, what were the 3 words that Dahl added that changed everything in New Haven from Atlanta? Did he say who's powerful in New Haven? He said that, but he didn't end there. What did he add that changed the results? Who's powerful in New Haven? In school board elections, in school board decision making, in mayoral elections, and who elects the mayor, and in business development. Not as one question, but as 3 distinct questions. And what did he then find that was different from Hunter? Yes.
Didn't you find out the mayor was something important in all 3 of them?
Exactly. But So you're giving, so we have three concentric circles, the mayor's in the center. But what is, the main point is not that, the main point is only the mayor was there. Whereas Hunter was talking, he said, business leadership dominates everything, and he didn't talk about it separate. He didn't introduce the concept, major concept, we talked about major concept, issue areas. That if you say, if you're looking for the leaders in mayoral elections, you get one set of answers. You look at the school board, you get different answers. Ask about business development, you get a third set of answers, a third set of people. And if you then look in more detail, that is, he didn't just ask that question. The main point of the decisional method was to reconstruct concrete decisions and study them in more detail. And in the whole book, he studied them, and he had three assistants down here. Polsky, Wolfinger, and Goldowski. Wolfinger and he really went into lots of meetings, they interviewed lots of people, they reconstructed it, and much of it is written up in the book. How was the mayoral election changing over the years? And how did that fit with or not fit with the broader conceptualization of this? Four, five, six concepts. Let me just remind you or ask you quickly if you got them still in the front of or back of your heads. Resources we've talked about, issue areas we've talked about, pyramiding. What's pyramiding? But these are, I'm asking you because these are not featured visibly by God. You've got to read closely. So I'm telling you, I'm giving you hints. Look for these concepts and remember the concepts and then some of the subtleties, because you can use these in the future. So pyramiding is when one set of people, to simplify, say one group has votes, another group has money, another group has mass media control. They only use three. If you get the three together, you can build a pyramid and have more impact on a political election, for example, if you have votes and the media and all those resources combining. If you can sort of stand on the top of the pyramid, and you can build more of a pyramid-like hierarchy and influence policy if you combine those resources. Whereas if you have one set of people with the money don't have the media, and the media people don't have the votes, you can have three different resources with different sets of people acting more pluralistically. Okay. So what that implies as well is not that it's right or wrong. Okay, well, I'm jumping into the third. The third column of researchers were people from the 60s onward said, hey, New Haven's different from Atlanta. Maybe they're both right to some degree. Maybe if we ask the same questions that Dahl did in Atlanta, we get the same list of people. Maybe we would find that business people were important in the school board, and they were important in business development and in mayoral elections. We don't know if we don't ask the question. So we said, let's go out and let's compare, not just Atlanta and New Haven, but, we started with 51 cities. Okay, so that was the beginnings of, and so this is on the, in terms of our reading list, this is in the community structure, this is the book. There was a conceptual framework that's changed from not just who governs, but where, when, and with what effects. The abbreviated title. Second, we want to have not just base resources, such as who's the mayor, or reputation, which we can ask, but also we want to have concrete decisions. And these were three, that is, let's ask all three of these questions. 3 different methods. Let's use them all in one interview. And then see how much they give the same answer to different answers. And the finding was, cities differ hugely. If you don't choose to study 2 cities or 5 cities, you don't know. But if you only study one, say my city is sort of like Athens and sort of like, the ideal democracy. New Haven's about the same size as Athens, so it must be an ideal democracy. I shouldn't caricature Dow because he was always, but he did say that. So the bottom line was, not only were there differences, but if you see that there are differences, then that breaks the black-white characterization of business dominance or political pluralism and says we have both. We may have combinations. We may have combinations in different cities and different states and different regions of the U.S. If we go to China, we go to Italy, we go to Norway, we find bigger differences still. Yeah.
Did they find any correlation between similar cities? For example, I could understand that New Haven and Atlanta are very different, but are Atlanta and Dallas more similar, or?
No, yes, that's exactly the program that these folks said we should add to what Hunter and Dahl had done before. And so that's what is on the reading list in the next page from the book called Community Structure and Decision Making. So there are 4 or 5 chapters, and you don't need to read all the detail, but the basic answer is developing a set of propositions of why, what are more general things like economic diversity or population size or wealth or education of citizens. How much do those factors lead towards more pluralism or less pluralism? That's the framing of the answers which are found in the book. And so the point, but I'm adding quickly that to get to that kind of framing, you transform the dichotomies that were used before, such as pluralistic versus business dominance. Instead, you say, it's a continuum, that you may have a city or a political system that is conceptually we can see, and then we can measure with the data we now have. We can rank cities in terms of their degree of pluralism versus business dominance. And then that includes 2 or 3 dimensions. One is who are the leaders? Are they political? Are they business? Are they citizens? 3. So that's so who are they? Second, how many are they? That is, if you ask these questions about who's important in town, and then actually look at the people who show up. If you go to Chicago City Council budget hearings, as I've done and talked to people who've been involved in that, we have hundreds of millions of dollars. Who shows up to budget hearings? Or who did traditionally? I haven't been there last week, but traditionally it was a union leader, maybe in more recent years, the League of Women Voters, and the Taxpayers Federation. Nobody else represented. I couldn't believe it. All this money is being spent, maybe the press, but they probably just would wait for a summary from somebody else. But the people who are really there, League of Women Voters, Chicago Taxpayers Federation, and under Daily One, there were no unions, basically. So in contrast to, say, this great book on Ann Arbor, which is more than New Haven. I mean, New Haven has got traditional ethnic background, business elite, all kinds of others. Ann Arbor does not. Ann Arbor is a college town. And the former mayor of Ann Arbor, professor of political science, wrote an excellent book about Ann Arbor's general political style. And it's pluralism gone wild. That is, you have a meeting on the budget, and the room is filled. Got lots of civic groups, lots of citizens. I'm concerned about Ann Arbor's budget. Are we spending $27.19 properly or not? So these things do exist. Israel, if you're on a kibbutz, everybody's supposed to be totally equal. More so than the New England ideal of Calvinism in LSR, but it's the same idea that strong egalitarianism says everybody should show up and participate. You should vote, and the framing of this, which we best know in America, comes from the League of Women Voters, and it's them there in the high school. You must participate. If you don't, you're immoral. It's sinful not to be responsible. Okay, so that's the New England. Get to Wall Street, not so clear. Get to the South. We should be in the 50s school, not gentlemen and ladies in Chicago or a proper southern town do not participate in this. They're done by traditional religion. Okay, plantation owners. That's it. So those ideals can be captured with specific analytical dimensions if we look more closely, and if we've got the data to say, hey, yes, Atlanta's here, Savannah, Georgia is there. Here's a smaller town that has, in Mississippi, which may have this. Yes.
I wanted to ask, so the data collected for citizen participation in that way at city council meetings, for example, is that controlling for education? Because I know that Ann Arbor is a city with one of the highest concentrations of PhDs. And I'm just wondering how education is considered or controlled in that sort of data comparison.
Okay.
Rather than that it does have an impact on.
Yeah, in the first section or two, I gave you, which something I'll reproduce now, which is basically what you get in more detail, elaborated in the community structure and decision-making book. We have leadership like the mayor, who's the mayor, which could be the opposition. Then what we've added is who governs, not just is he a WASP or not, but where, when, and with what effects. So what are the policy outputs? Is the budget higher or lower? Are taxes going up or down? And then over here, what we've added explicitly are community characteristics like education, percent PhDs in Ann Arbor, the mean educational level of citizens, or it can be the percent in poverty or below poverty, or any other local citizen general city characteristics, as well as anything else that looks as if it might matter, such as being next to a river, if you're talking about fish, or next to the flooding, etc. So the point is, if you look for sure, education makes a huge impact. But you use the word control for. What this is a little different. Rather than saying we control for, we say we want to build an interrelated set of propositions, and including feedback. After taxes go up, and when we talk about Sasana said, you may have inequality may rise in New York City, and that in turn may lead to people fighting, occupying Wall Street and saying the 1% are stealing our money. Okay, so the policy output of having more inequality and inequality increasing in the US, a change in leadership, or at least in terms of the framing of the political culture, the speeches, and so forth. Okay, so You can then say, how important is leadership controlling for education, your word. But what I'm stressing is you don't just want to control one thing. Or when you say the type of city is all of these. And a properly, the economist uses this term analytically, a properly specified model or a fully specified model in contrast to a reduced form model would have all of this stuff. And when the economists build a model of the GNP, roughly how many variables do they have? Thousands. I'm putting on 5 or 15 here maybe. So thousands of things are going on. But we can simplify a bit, and so it's okay to try to say, but I mean, you can't deal with thousands of things simultaneously. So what you do is say, okay, in this box, if we're trying to analyze, the leadership, does the mayor have the appointment authority over the special agencies or not? And in some cities he does, he or she does, and in other cities it's the city council. And others, it's the assessors or someone else. So in that sense, the legal specifics may enter and transform how some of this works. But I'm just maybe it sounds trivial, but I'm saying don't only think in terms of controlling for or type. Look for the specifics because they're now in this section of readings. How can you put together a systems model? This is now a political system in that it shows the major parts operating together and showing that if you look just at one, you can't understand the whole thing unless you have these other things included. And precisely because Hunter and Dahl left them out, we added this, and that changes the meaning and through looking at the context of leadership. So we're taking Dahl, who added issue areas, and we're just doing it in one better, pushing it further still. We're having good some good Q&A. I could, you know what? Let's we're still on Bernie. We do or don't? Okay, they may have a Bernie Sanders, but most of you have heard of, I think, Bernie Sanders. And why is he important for Donald Trump and other things in U.S. national politics, which are visible around the world? If you were a strong Democrat supporter of Hillary Clinton, what would you say about why did you lose the election to Trump? I mean, it's a simplified question. I mean, there are hundreds of variables that are going on, but I would say one big thing which happened was within the Democratic Party primary. What were the main voices? Bernie and Hillary Clinton. Okay, so that is Bernie Sanders, and today in Washington they're not necessarily called Bernie followers, it's called progressives. But this is going on right now. This week they're trying to negotiate a budget compromise involving the Democrats. The Democrats are fighting against each other. And basically, you still have people who are closer to Bernie Sanders, who today are called progressives, loosely, versus the centrist Democrats. Okay, we got Bernie to talk to us. Go ahead, Bernie. What do you?
Let me just make sure that things will play on the right speaker.
Okay.
Yeah, bits and pieces everywhere, like nowhere and capitalism. The other one is the debate that you.
Okay.
And this is great. I mean, that's the key thing. But you have a little bit more you want to show too?
There's one debate that they're talking about, this is the debate.
Okay, now if you can easily bring it up, fine.
Yep, I got it right here.
Okay, go ahead.
Of the United States.
So I would change our approach to the Middle East. We need a new paradigm in the Middle East.
I think being the first woman president would be quite a change.
Protect the Main Street economy from recklessness on Wall Street. I would push to separate out these too big to jail, too big to fail banks.
When millions of people begin to come together and stand up and say our government is going to work for all of us, not just a handful of billionaires.
I would lead working with both parties in the Congress and working through them in the traditional way that our Constitution
Senator
is
Sanders, will you say anything to get
I
elected?
think that, like most people that I know, I have a range of views, but they are rooted in my values and my experience.
What Democratic social
Some people would say Bernie Sanders destroyed the legitimacy of Hillary Clinton. That because he took the support away from her in part and pushed her, tried to push her, that in turn led to her taking positions or her getting a corrupt, that the Democrats had made that in the big way of looking at this, one big way, not just turnout and so forth, but not just number of votes for her, but the proportion, but the turnout. That is how many Democrats turned out and voted. And the huge difference from Obama was that with Hillary Clinton as a candidate, the Democratic Party turnout was much lower. Whereas with Obama, especially in Obama's first election, was much higher. He mobilized people who were excited to really transform America. She did not. And that in turn, these elections were close. And so in a sense, we could say that Sanders, and many people were criticizing that he did, you could say, he elected Trump. So, but as these divisions are still with us, I'm not saying anything's good or bad, and I'm not clearly saying there's one cause. So there are many different factors going on. But when votes are close in numbers, and you have more, and you begin to add more subtle things like charisma, legitimacy, the dimensions that Max Weber talked about in other places, not just in this essay, but especially charisma, or things we talk about in these scenescapes, for glamour, charisma, transgression, neighborliness. All of these play a role in leading people to vote or not to vote, to say, my heart is there and I will, I'll write you a $50 check, or I'll work 7 days, for this. 7 days a week. I mean, I knew people, that is, a lot of students who in previous years from some of these different time periods, they'd take a 1 year, they'd take a leave, maybe for a quarter, maybe for 3 quarters, and they'd work for political candidates. And they were, okay, and they changed elections. So, okay, those are the main points. Comments, questions? You've been asking, or I've been asking you, and you've been answering or having trouble answering. Things that you should ideally still carry in your head, even after the midterms, and even after the final. We want to help you not just get a better grade, but to think about these things usefully to yourself. Comments, questions? Right, yeah.
So what would stuff get? Global cities about it?
Sure, go ahead.
It wasn't super clear to me what, like, this, her theory sounded, I don't know, very likely, probable. What were, did you have data backing some of what we read? Or, like particularly this tends to like imitate global cities, right? She's talking about this dispersion of the media, and other cities, oh, Chicago downtown, we want the multi-story building as well. Is there data that shows that, or is that just
Probably for 90% of what all social scientists say, they have no data.
yeah.
So they're putting pieces together, but she goes further than many others in not explicitly, implicitly joining Adam Smith and Karl Marx. And so she's explaining inequality with market competition and the extent of the market. However, what there clearly is not in the entire book is anything explicit about politics or consumption specifics and lifestyle and value. So key aspects of a big theory that we're talking about in the first 5 sections. There's no political culture, there's no politics, there's no political leadership. But only really business and some people as workers are working there. So the simplest answer, and I was here working with her and working with her key assistants when they were revising, wrote the 2nd edition. And I would say, it's a great time to add some, politics and culture to make this multi-process book more close to my favorite. She and the research systems, no politics. In her other book, she does talk about politics and some of these specific dynamics. But this is her most serious social science book. No politics. So, okay. That's the quick answer. And she has very few footnotes. So some of this she might have been able to, and in the new edition, they did add more footnotes, but they're still, in terms of your question, 90%.
Okay.
Yes.
I guess also kind of writing like the idea of localization. To what extent is kind of when we're talking about localization, are we talking about it maybe on a uniform, I guess, level versus more so just between these local cities? I guess I'm thinking like I'm from like a relatively small town, and like when I think about kind of global interaction I see when I'm in Chicago versus when I'm at home, obviously very different. Like when we're talking about globalization, is it kind of just between these cities, or is there kind of maybe a ripple effect where it eventually leads out to these smaller cities as well?
How about Ann Arbor? It's a small town. Is it global?
I guess maybe about
If you take the percentage of emails that are global, written by people in Ann Arbor, compared to people in New York or Chicago, what percentage would be, which would be more global? Probably Ann Arbor. That is, academics, researchers think global. I mean, if you're a physicist or mathematician, you want the best equation, the best data, whether it's in South Africa or Argentina or wherever. And so I would say the small college towns are dramatic reputations of the idea that city size really drives, is a measure of globalization.
I'm from Charlottesville, so I see maybe a lot of aspects. I guess maybe
Absolutely.
within UK, but.
Okay. Let's continue. Next class. Okay, folks.